Running backs bust more than any other position in the NFL. I trawled through 20 years of fantasy data looking for patterns. Stick around to find out what I learned and how it impacted my rookie running back rankings on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we're talking running backs. If you haven't already, make sure you go back and check out my quarterback video where I went through the hit rates of every quarterback in the last 20 years. Today I'm going to do the same thing for running backs, and we know this is a weak running back class, so it's going to be interesting to see where we can find value or if we just ignore the position altogether. Before I do that, make sure you like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you're on Instagram, check me out at the Fantasy First Down. I answer all your questions over there. If you're on Twitter, I'm at Fantasy First Down with no O. And my website with all my rankings on it is ffdfantasyfootball.com. Today, we're talking hit rates. And to do that, I'll take you quickly through my methodology. It's a little bit different for the running backs because running backs don't last as long in the NFL, and also because they have more in the position starting. I've allowed the brackets, I guess, for each of my ranking positions to be a little bit wider. So I've considered superstars to be any player with a top 5 finish among running backs, and they needed to be fantasy relevant for at least 5 years. Fantasy relevant for me for running backs meant a top 50 running back. Top 50 running backs basically means they'll probably be on fantasy rosters. If they're doing it for 5 years and they've had a good finish, that probably means they've been really good. And most of these players were top 5 for multiple years. Starts at top 10, they've got to be relevant for at least 4 years. Starters, top 24 in 4 years, and so on and so forth. You can see it at the bottom. I also had guys who are brief booms and brief value players. They're guys who are either top 10 or at least top 60, but not for as long, and therefore that obviously limits their value. Anyone that doesn't at least fit into one of those categories is a bust by my metrics. To do that, I'm going to take us through each of the different positions in which these players were drafted in the NFL draft. So as you can see, there were no first-round players this year, so I've broken it down based on round. My second-round guys doesn't include the guys taken early in the second round. For whatever reason, players taken particularly early in the second round seem to have a lot more values than players taken later in the round. And the only second-round player in this year's draft was Jonathan Brooks, and he was taken in the later half of the second round. So for that reason, I've only looked at the guys from pick 41 to pick 64. Then obviously I've gone through the whole third round, whole fourth round, whole fifth round, and then the sixth and seventh rounds. For the second round, guys, I need to go all the way back to 2004 to find enough guys. For every other position, I've just gone back to 2010 because before that was a little bit hard to find the data easily. At the end, I'll also talk about undrafted players who are significantly more likely to hit for running backs. We'll see just how much more likely. Now, Jonathan Brooks is the first player off the board for a lot of people, and you can see why. Being taken in the second round is a big step up compared to being taken in the third round. Even though we're only talking about the later part of the second round, that barrier of the second, third round border makes a big difference. We're talking about guys like Jonathan Taylor, Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Derrick Henry, guys who've been stars in the NFL, and they're all taken into this period of time between pick 41 and pick 64. There's also been plenty of consistent players. We've seen Kenneth Walker there more recently. James Cook's been successful in the last couple of years. Carlos Hyde was around for a long time. Realistically, we don't actually see as many busts in this region as you'd think. Most of the busts that I found weren't even particularly recent. The most recent guys were people like Darius Geis, Bishop Sankey was a couple of years back, but none of these guys were drafted within the last 5 or so years. Teams have become really frugal with these second-round picks, and they're really only willing to use it on a running back if they're really committed to that running back. And we've seen that happen time and time again. So I think that says really good things for Jonathan Brooks. I think you can be a lot more confident in him than you can in any of the other running backs in this class. I think he's the clear top running back, and it's not even close. I wasn't previously really considering taking him too early in the first round of rookie drafts because I felt this was such a weak running back class. But if you need a running back, you have to take Brooks. He is by far the most likely to hit. He's by far the least likely to bust based on everything that we see. Now, guys do bust in this range, but like I said, most of them were quite a long time ago. Most of the recent players don't. Now, there is a little bit of value in that third round, and we'll talk about it in a second, but you're more likely to get a superstar in this early round that's worth taking the risk for that, even though we're still only really talking about a 1 in 4 chance. Honestly, my preference with running backs, if you're trying to win right now, just go out and trade for a really good running back. Most people will know that their running backs only have a year or two. There's going to be running backs on weak teams. They know they need to sell those players and try to rebuild. That's your best way of getting a reliable running back at the moment. This is not the easiest way, but if you've got that rookie pick and you want to spend it on a running back, go and get Brooks. Now, third round gets a little bit interesting. We still have plenty of players who became solid fantasy players. We've obviously had guys like Alvin Kamara, DeMarco Murray. David Johnson was obviously very good for a little while. And more recently, guys like Rashad White was a third-round player. David Montgomery. We saw Kareem Hunt come out in the third round and do surprisingly well. Brian Robinson's another name that's going around the league at the moment. Devin Singletary. These guys are solid players, but there's not as many top-end studs. Outside guys like Kamara, recently there really haven't been a lot of really good NFL running backs coming out of the third round and beyond. Most of the time, these guys are just reliable, solid starters or worse. You can certainly see there's a lot more in that mid-range starter to backup sort of region than you get with the earlier rounds, and it's certainly a lot more compared to the first round. For reference, by the way, every running back in the last 20 years taken within the top 10 picks in the NFL draft has finished as a top 10 running back in their first NFL season up until Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson is actually the worst rookie season by a top 10 running back draft pick in the last 20 years, and he's still a good player. So you can get really good running backs early on, but there aren't any this year. And that means we have to be looking at these third-round guys and hoping that something hits. Now, there is some ability here, and I think Trey Benson's the name that comes up most, but the bust possibility is so high. And especially when you start talking about guys like Marshawn Lloyd and Blake Corum, you're looking at that bust probability and thinking, the odds of them not working out at all is surprisingly high, especially for someone like Corum, who's basically going into a backup position immediately. I think that there's a massive amount of risk here, and you've got to understand that when taking third-round running backs. I wouldn't be touching any of these guys until at least the second round of drafts. I will go through my rankings at the end and talk about how I compare them to the other rounds. Now, there's plenty of people who like fourth-round running backs, and there's a couple of big names in this year's draft. Jalen White obviously goes to Miami. They've been very good at running the ball recently. Ray Davis is someone I really like going to Buffalo, but they're still fourth-round running backs, and that's pretty scary. There haven't been a lot of true superstars taken in the fourth round recently. In the last 15 seasons, Devonta Freeman, Lamar Miller. And Lamar Miller was pretty hot and cold. He had 1 or 2 really good seasons. He finished as the RB5 once. And I know because I had him in fantasy the next year in quite a few teams. He was not particularly good after that. Moving teams probably didn't help. But we are talking about a situation where you're not seeing a lot of real superstars. We've got guys like Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, who were at least solid, but ultimately a bit disappointing. James White was very good for a while, but not in your traditional running back situation. In fact, I needed to look pretty hard just to find guys who'd even been starters at all. Guys like Chase Edmonds. Hard to remember him ever being a fantasy starter, but he was very briefly. Jamal Williams obviously had that big touchdown season recently, but we're talking about situations where a lot of these guys are busting. Nearly 3/4 of these players aren't going to give you fantasy value long-term, and over half of them aren't giving you fantasy value ever. This is not a situation you want to be in. You do not want to be going out of your way to get these guys. The chances of them succeeding in any way at all is pretty low. Now, we do have to remember that these numbers on the top end might rise slightly as teams continue to undervalue running backs. As these guys continue to fall in drafts, the better players are going to start getting taken a little bit later, and that might make a difference. But until that happens, I don't think we can rely on that happening. I certainly wouldn't be giving up good, reliable prospects for a shot at these guys, because the odds of them actually hitting in any meaningful way, we're talking 30% at best. And it gets even worse when we hit the 5th round. And these are a lot of names that people like quite a lot. Tyrone Tracy's been a name that I've heard a lot of people talking about. Audric Esteem's another person that people have been talking about trying to get in their 3rd and 4th round of rookie drafts. And I understand there's not a lot of good players available in the 3rd and 4th rounds of your rookie drafts. But look at the odds of these players succeeding. It's pretty darn low. The players that have done it recently, Kyron Williams, Aaron Jones, they've obviously turned into really good running backs, but there's not much behind those guys. Jordan Howard was a bit of a flash in the pan, but he did at least hang around and have fantasy relevance for a while. Jerome Ford's managed to succeed really only because Nick Chubb got injured, and he was useless in his first season. Chris Thompson was a good receiving back. We see quite a few of those guys appear in the later rounds. And then we're talking about guys like Alex Collins and Kenny Gainwell. These are not good fantasy players. These are not guys you want on your fantasy teams. They're not offering you very much at all. The odds of you succeeding and really picking a player who's going to be helpful for your fantasy team, we're talking about barely over 20%. And not many of these guys are turning into superstars. Maybe one of these 5 guys could be useful at some stage. And good luck trying to work out which one it is, because there's probably going to be a fair element of luck as well. This is a range that I would be avoiding if I had the choice. Having said that, once we're in the 4th round of a rookie draft, there's really not a lot of good options available at all. If anything, that should be telling you that you probably need to value those 3rd and 4th round picks a lot less. And if you have them, there's probably some good wide receivers available, because this is a really good, deep wide receiver class. I do like the talent of some of these later round running backs, but look at that success rate. It's just not worth risking it to go out of your way and get these guys unless you're stuck with a pick and you need to pick somebody. And a lot of you will be in that position. Gets even uglier in the 6th and 7th round. There's not a lot of big names that have popped up here. The best I could find was Latavius Murray and Alfred Morris. And that was out of 86 players that I looked at. They were the best too. We're not talking about stars. We're talking about guys who had 1, 2, maybe useful seasons. Isaiah Pacheco's been pretty solid, and he looks like he could be a good player, but he's yet to have a top 10 fantasy finish. We're not talking about a guy who's been reliable. We're talking about a guy who hasn't offered very much at all yet, but he seems like he might have taken over a starting role. He could turn into the best player in this round. Chris Carson, I think, probably also could have been a better player if it wasn't for injuries. So there's some talent here, but the chances of you finding a guy is low. We're talking 10% maybe. And there are some names here that people are going out of their way to get. I see a lot of people talking about Kamani Vidal, for example. Dylan Lowry is a good receiving back, but realistically, the odds of these guys hitting is really, really low. And you need to understand that when you try to value these players. There's even some value with undrafted players. There have been undrafted free agents who've been successful running backs. It is easier to be an undrafted free agent and be successful at the running back position because of how the running back position works. We're talking about guys like Austin Eckler, in particular, who's been a real star, was an undrafted free agent. Raheem Mostert has been very good, was the running back 3 last year. Obviously, it took him a while to get going. He's now in his 30s. Jalen Warren's obviously made a big impact for the Steelers. Gus Edwards could be the starter for the Chargers this year. So we're talking about some names that have been successful. James Robinson was really big for a year or two. I think he had a running back 4 finish at one stage, but he was very much a flash in the pan. So there are some players who've had some success, but you've got to remember that finding those players is really difficult. We're not talking about a situation where there's like 5 or 10 guys each year like there were with the earlier rounds. We're talking about dozens of running backs going into NFL teams and having a chance to make the roster. Most NFL teams will have 3 wide receivers who are undrafted free agents and maybe 2 running backs who are undrafted free agents. So we're talking about 60 guys, and that's only the rookies from this year. There are going to be other undrafted guys from other years who are also floating around as well, plus the free agents. That's who these guys are competing with, and that's just to make the roster. The odds of you being a success early on in a way that is useful for your fantasy roster is pretty much non-existent. I would not be going out of my way to go and get these guys. Now, I really like Cody Schrader. I really wish he was drafted, but he goes to the 49ers, who already took a guy in the 3rd round in Isaac Guerrero. There's no chance of him having much success at all. He's not someone I'm going out of my way to get at all. There's plenty of guys. Dylan Johnson's another guy that goes to the Titans that people are trying to get. Don't. I know the name Frank Gore Jr. is exciting, but there's no point in going out and getting him. Realistically, undrafted free agents, for the most part, bust. It's just what they do. And it's not really even really a true bust. The teams aren't paying very much for them. They're not expecting much. At best, they may be expecting a guy who can help on special teams and might somehow by a fluke turn into something one day. So there's very little value down the bottom end for NFL running backs in the later rounds in day 3, and especially for undrafted players. They're just not guys you want to go out and get. If you're going to find value, it's got to be in the earlier rounds. And there's only one player drafted in the first 2 rounds who's a running back this season. It's a weak class. For that reason, here are my rankings. This is my top 20. I'll go through the other 10 in a second. Jonathan Brooks is number 1 for me, and it's not close. I was not confident he was going to be the first running back off the board. There are a lot of injury concerns with him, but he clearly goes into the best position. We've seen Carolina be able to succeed with running backs. We've seen them have success with Chuba Hubbard, obviously Christian McCaffrey a while ago, but Brooks is not McCaffrey. But they've managed to take average running backs and have some success with them. For that reason, I feel pretty positive about Brooks' chance of succeeding. I think this is very clearly his backfield. I don't think there's going to be a lot of competition with Brooks, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. He's the clear number 1 off the board. Where do you take him in rookie drafts? Well, I wouldn't put him anywhere near the top 3 wide receivers. He's not even on the same planet as those guys. I wouldn't put him anywhere near Brock Bowers. Even in a 1 QB league, he'd still go behind Caleb Williams for me and probably also behind Jaden Daniels. He kind of goes into that next range. So 7th pick onwards maybe would be the situation where I'd take him. If you're really strong at quarterback, you might take him over the quarterbacks. But realistically, I think he's probably less likely to succeed than probably 7 or 8 different wide receivers available in this draft. I think the first guy I'd really consider taking him over is maybe Xavier Legette. Obviously, they both go to Carolina, but the Carolina running game is at least a little bit better than their passing game. So there's probably 7 wide receivers I like better than Brooks, and you're going to have to wait till the next video to see how I order my wide receivers. So it's real awkward. I don't like this situation at all with the running backs. And while I would happily take Brooks in the first round somewhere, I'd want it to be late on in the first round. Otherwise, you're just not getting any value at all. It gets pretty ugly pretty quickly after that. Trey Benson's the pretty clear number 2 to me, but I don't even know that he's the number 1 in his team. James Conner's really good, and I think that the Cardinals are trying to think a little bit more into the future, but they're not going to run Trey Benson into the ground when they're not winning yet. And I don't think they're set up to win this season. So I think this is more of a future 1 or 2 years down the road view. Plus, they need to have a backup for when Conner gets injured, because that inevitably happens, not only with all running backs, but with James Conner in particular. So Benson's a viable option. He's a good player. He easily could have been the first running back off the board. But the fact that he went on the 3rd round means a lot. Teams tell you how they feel about players when they choose to draft them or not. And 32 teams didn't feel like he deserved to go in the first 2 rounds, and that should tell you something. Sorry, choking on my excitement. He's clearly a 3rd round back. I don't see a situation where I would want him anywhere near the first round of rookie drafts. I'd be considering early to mid 2nd round potentially. And even then, there's a big gap from him to Blake Corum. You can see he was taken a good 17 picks ahead of Corum, and he goes into a significantly better situation. Corum is clearly the backup from Kyren Williams, but he might work his way into some sort of role eventually. Williams has been around for a couple of years, so it's possible they move on from him and Corum takes over in a couple of years. And in the meantime, if Williams gets injured, he's going to be useful, and he's probably going to do a little bit of receiving work before then, because I think he's probably a better receiving back than Kyren Williams. So there's going to be at least a little bit of playability for a while, but we saw with those percentages before, realistically, most of these backs after him aren't going to be very good. So Corum at least gives you the chance of something happening. But we're talking about 50% at best that he turns into something fantasy relevant. And I'm talking about something good. I'm just talking about something that will at some stage help your fantasy team. Ray Davis is a guy that I personally like. And he's actually moved up a little bit for me. But not a lot. I've moved him up slightly simply because I like what's going on there in his situation. There's been some talk that we might be surprised how much he gets used, and I think that makes sense. I don't think Buffalo really wanted to use James Cook a lot last year. They seem to want to keep him fresh, giving him a limited amount of carries, but make him really effective with those carries. And I think it makes sense to bring in Davis, who can be that guy who's a little bit bigger, who can do a lot of that goal line work. He's also a pretty good receiving back as well. That's the value touches. You kind of want the goal line touches and you want the receiving work. I feel like James Cook's going to be doing the kind of explosive work between the 20s, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if Ray Davis gets the expensive touches. He might not get a lot of touches, but I think they're going to have fantasy value. For that reason, I think he could be useful, and I think he could turn into an every down starter potentially. That's not true of a lot of these other backs, and that's why I've got him ranked a little bit high. But as we know, with fourth round guys, the odds of that happening is pretty low. He was taking 40 picks after guys like Blake Corum. It's just that he goes into a significantly better situation. I've really tossed up him and Marshall and Lloyd, and this is the first time I really thought about putting Lloyd earlier. I originally had Lloyd back at my 8th pick, but he's a third-round pick, and I think you have to value that. Plus, we are starting to hear a little bit more about AJ Dillon being totally out of things, and Lloyd's the backup, and he potentially takes over from Josh Jacobs within a season or two. I can see that happening, and I think it does give him some value, so I've moved him up a little bit. But I'm very nervous about this whole situation. The Packers don't have a great history of doing a good job of selecting running backs and then making it work. They're better off, in fact, selecting guys like Aaron Jones in the 5th round than guys like AJ Dillon in the 2nd round. So I'm not really sure how good I feel about this Marshall and Lloyd situation, but I'm at least valuing the fact that he's a 3rd-round pick and the fact that that's a big difference compared to the guys who were taken 30 to 40 picks later. That's why I've moved him forward, not because of the talent and not because of the situation. Bucky Irving takes a bit of a drop for me. I've had more time to kind of reflect on what situation he's moving into, and I just don't like the chances of being used effectively as an every down back at some stage. I think he's probably more likely to be a top 40 back at some stage in his career than a lot of the other guys in this range, because I think he's probably going into a receiving role. I think he's going to be pretty effective at that. But while we've seen some receivers be good fantasy players, we got names like James White. We saw names like Theo Riddick on that list of later round guys who've been successful receiving backs. I just don't know it's something you want to rely on. So I think he's going to be a solid player, but I wouldn't expect him to be anything more than that receiving back who has that elite speed, and they probably will use on things like kickoffs as well. I think a lot of these guys were drafted because of their special teams ability more than anything, because we know that kickoff returns are going to be a bigger part of the game in the coming seasons. Speaking of speed, Jalen Wright goes to the Dolphins. Of course, they picked another speedy back. I think this is more of a Raheem Mostert contingency plan. I think they probably recognize that Mostert's only got another season or two in them. They can't use Achane as an every single down back. They need to have another guy in there. Wilson's also in his 30s as well. Salman Ahmed, I mean, that's not going to work. So while they've got plenty of depth, I don't think they really believe that their depth is either young enough or good enough to be used. So they bring in someone who can add to that. This is the sort of range where that makes sense. So while it might seem really exciting he's going there, I don't think they see him as anything more than just a piece they can kind of add in when necessary. He might pan out in a season or two, but I'm not really sure that I see it happening in the near future. Will Shipley is a player that I think is an okay option, but he goes into a really awkward situation. They've still got Kenny Gainwell there. They brought in Saquon Barkley. Saquon's the clear starter. But even when Saquon came in, there were a lot of rumors going around they wanted to bring in another running back. I thought if one came in the first couple of rounds, that would be a really good sign of what they're planning on doing. They're doing a little bit of a Lions-style Thunder and Lightning situation. Shipley coming in the 4th round, doesn't really give me that same feeling. He's a solid shifty back, but I don't think he's ever going to turn into an every down back. I think he's just an option they can use alongside Barkley. That is value for the team, but I don't think it really has a lot of value for fantasy, and that's why he's a lot lower for me. Isaac Guerendo, he's clearly going in as a potential backup. It's going to be him versus Elijah Mitchell. Wouldn't shock me if he wins that backup role, but it's still only really a backup role. They're going to use McCaffrey for another couple of seasons, and after that, who knows? They'll probably drafted another back before that. The 49ers have a really bad history of drafting total duds with their running backs, so I'm not expecting much from Guerendo, but I do have to respect the range in which he's going. Same thing with Braylon Allen. It's a really awkward situation where Breece Hall's just so clearly the number one back, and even if he's not, Allen probably not even going to be an every down back if Hall is out, so that's why he's quite a bit lower for me. He's still a 4th round back, and that's better than being taken in those later rounds. He might get some goal line work, but I can't imagine a situation where you're going to be starting him without Hall being injured. Now, I won't harp on too much about 11 to 20. Most of these guys are guys you don't particularly want on your rosters. Their chance of hitting is very low. We saw that about fifth and sixth round guys. But my favorite is Tyrone Tracy, mainly because my man Tane, who works with me at FFD, is a big fan on him, and he's got a surprising hit rate of being right about these sorts of things. So I've moved him up my rankings because I respect his thoughts on this. He believes Tracy's a guy who's really shifty guy, will become the clear backup here and may even take over from Devin Singletary at some stage over the season. I don't know if that's true, but I'm willing to move him up mainly because I don't really feel strongly about any of the guys below him. Audric Esteen goes into a really awkward situation where it's not clear who the number one is, but it's probably not him. People are going to get excited because there's no clear number one, but I think you'd actually rather be a clear number two than be in a situation where no one knows who the number one is. That sort of situation rarely works out particularly well. Dylan Lowry goes in as a clear receiving back in Vegas, and I think they clearly need one of those. So I think this is a good situation for him because Zamir White is not known as a receiving back. So he could get a surprising amount of work. Having said that, he's still got to win the job off of Amir Abdullah first, and that's not a given. I think it's probably going to happen, but it's not a given. Kamani Vidal goes to the Chargers, and they've got their clear number one and number two backs. I mean, no one particularly loves Gus Edwards or J.K. Dobbins, but they're the clear top two backs there. Vidal will be involved in some way, whether it's special teams or as the third or fourth back, but we've seen them struggle to get use out of Joshua Kelly, out of Isaiah Spiller, and they all went earlier than Vidal. So I think you really need to take Vidal with a big grain of salt. Rasheen Ali goes into situations maybe the Derrick Henry replacement, even though Henry only just arrived. I think he's more likely to be a nothing, but you never know. He suddenly goes into a situation where an opportunity will exist within the next season or two. Isaiah Davis is a weird situation. I think he's probably more of a special teams guy because he goes to a team who's already has a great back and then selects a back in the fourth round. It seems a little bit crazy to take Davis in the fifth round, so I'm assuming this is a special teams play. Jawad Jordan's more of a receiving back, but I think he's probably ultimately more of a special teams player. They already have a kind of a receiving back there and a good Mwale, plus Joe Mixon could already receive anyway, but I can see a reason why they might do this for special teams purposes more than anything else. Jace McClellan goes to Atlanta. I think they like Tyler Algier fine, but they do have a new coaching staff over there. We don't know what Raheem Morris is going to do, but we do know that Bijan Robinson's the clear number one guy. I think McClellan's probably at best a backup, at worst a special teamer. Killen Robinson goes to Jacksonville. They've already got way too much going on there. They've got Travis Etienne, obviously, as the number one guy. He was the second running back in fantasy last season, despite not playing every down. They brought in Tank Bigsby with a third-round pick and then barely used him. They used Dearness Johnson instead, who they brought in as well. So I don't really see how Robinson fits into that picture. I'm not interested at all. Cody Schrader is my favorite undrafted free agent, but I already talked about undrafted free agents. They have very little value. It's just it felt weird having a top 19. So I put in a guy who I loved in college fantasy, but I can't imagine him having any value here. Having said that, if someone's going to use him in an effective way, it's probably the 49ers. So I like his situation more than anyone else. And that's all I've got for you today. I will be back in the next couple of days with my wide receivers, and there's a lot to talk about wide receivers because there's a lot of good rookie wide receivers, and they're in a good range of different spaces, and so it's interesting to be able to work out how to value them based on the fact that a lot of people like a few of the later guys better than a few of the earlier guys. So I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation. I've already had a look at the numbers, and it made me think a lot about moving my guys around. So I'm looking forward to you joining me then. If you haven't already, make sure you follow me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. I answer all your questions on there. Also follow us on Twitter at Fantasy First Down. You can go to my website at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and my YouTube, of course, is the Fantasy First Down. Make sure you like this video and subscribe. Also, make sure you go and check out my articles on Razzball. I'll be writing up more articles about these hit rates and going into a little bit more detail about a couple of the things that I've talked about today. I'll also be dropping some stuff about my dynasty rankings and some specific stuff about players that have been moving up or down recently. There's a full list of articles on ffdfantasyfootball.com. I will catch you guys in the next day.